philosophy of human solidarity. And we're going to go up. The way we approach our work, we're less of speech givers. We come out of a very Socratic, popular education background, so we're going to make this a very interactive hour and 15, hour and a half that we have together. So please be ready to participate, because we're going to need your energy and your thoughts to move this process, this time we have together. In 2002, I went to the World Social Forum in Brazil. And the theme of the social forum was, another world is possible. And that theme is the underlying essence of the philosophy of human solidarity. And so we're going to go today, this time we have, to a very step-by-step journey that's going to share some of the key components of how you create human solidarity, and how human solidarity can be a force, a philosophy, a way of approaching the work you do that can not only heal the divides that we have, because you would agree that we have a lot of divides across our nation right now. Would you agree? Right. And would you also agree that our nation is deeply in the need of healing? No matter what side of the political spectrum you come from, no matter your race, your gender, your educational background, your class, people are suffering. You know, we have the benefit of traveling across the country, doing work across many different institutions, from work in Hollywood to police departments to social service agencies, universities, and not one area do we go that we don't see human beings in pain. And so what that has reinforced for us is that we all of us in this room, have got to take our work to a much deeper level. And so part of our presentation, I'm going to invite my colleague up, our Chief of Staff, Daniel John, who's going to assist in some of the writing and part of the exercises we'll do together. So come on up, Daniel. Let's give him a round of applause. So I live in Seattle, Washington. I was born and raised in New Jersey, but I've lived and worked in Seattle, Washington for the past 25 years. And the vast majority of my work was centered around anti-racist organizing. We did a lot of trainings around the history of racism, the construction of racism, how racism lived in our systems and institutions. And we did this work across every institution and system, working in criminal justice, government, education, social services, nonprofits, housing, you name it, we were working there. And Seattle is an incredibly liberal and progressive city. And so through that work, we were able to get a lot of initiatives on the board. One of the things you see on the slide deck is a race and equity toolkit. Are people familiar with this? So if you're not familiar with the race and equity toolkit, what it's supposed to do is that any policy that is designed by government, any initiative or program, is supposed to be ran through this toolkit, and if it's shown to disproportionately hurt or harm poor people or people of color, they're supposed to be mitigating actions taken, corrective actions to reduce that harm. Now on paper, this is a great tool. But the truth is, in reality, it was only used for the low-hanging fruit. When it came to policies that were really driven by money and money interests, the toolkit would not be used. To give you a good example, we were organizing to stop the building of a new youth detention center in Seattle. And on any given day, there would be roughly 40 young people in the King County Juvenile Detention Center. But they were proposing to build a new detention center, $300 million facility with 150 beds. And so we looked at this and we thought that, well, if you're going to build 150 beds, just like if we were building a hotel, you're not going to just leave those beds empty. You're going to be locking up more kids. And our thought was that it is wrong public policy to spend this $300 million on building a new detention center. We could put that money on the front end. And so this effort galvanized the whole city across every spectrum you could imagine. And so eventually we sat down with the King County executive. Martin Luther King County has a governmental structure where the executive is essentially the mayor of the county. And so he had on his website the toolkit. He talked about his fidelity to using the toolkit. And when we brought it up around the jail, he refused to do the toolkit on the jail because he knew what would come out. And And he also knew that a lot of the corporations behind building his jail were funding his campaign. And the next day, he took all this off of his website. Then eventually they came back and said, well, you can do the toolkit, but you can't talk about the jail, or that defeats the purpose. And so, again, on paper, everyone in Seattle, we're all Democratic, all blue. We even had socialists on our city council. We have every initiative you could ever want in every institution. Everybody speaks all the right language. 99.9% of all the folks that we have met and engaged with are well-intentioned people who don't want to do harm, but yet still, after all these years of work, the outcomes by every single measurable in the city of Seattle were getting worse. Housing disproportionality was going up. If you were poor and working class in the city of Seattle, you cannot afford to live in Seattle because of the soaring housing prices. The incarceration rates for juveniles as well as adults were going up, as well as racial disproportionality. African Americans make up roughly 8 to 10% of King County, or over 45% of those incarcerated. Every single measurable, after all these years of work, all this teaching, all this pushing for policy change, the outcomes were getting worse. And so we have to look at that and to see what were we doing that was a problem. And again, we became experts at talking about systemic and structural racism, experts on the problems, but we weren't yet clear on how to really create solutions. And so we also have to look at the state of us, those of us who are in leadership positions, sitting in rooms like this, asking people to be different, to change how they were doing the work. And I put up this slide to show, I did this work at pretty much every level. I was taking over the mayor's office, sitting in, getting arrested, marching, protesting. Then eventually I started doing more institutional level work, and I actually became the interim director of the Race and Social Justice Initiative for the city of Seattle. And while doing this work, I was getting all sorts of awards, was traveling all over the country, all over the world actually doing this work, was on Macklemore's albums and going on the Sway Show, speaking with him. I was really lifted up as this superstar organizer. Was also part of this national initiative setting up what we call freedom schools all around the country that were helping to teach young people how to become leaders and organizers and to understand the impact of racism on their lives. So I was, again, lifted up as this superstar organizer, but in truth, my life was collapsing. I was drinking myself to sleep every night. I was cheating on my partner. I was gambling. And I was struggling with deep, deep depression. Sometimes it would be hard for me to get out of bed for 3 or 4 days. Also, you can see the dissonance in this. Also looking at my colleagues who were also out pushing for change around racism, some of their children were being murdered. People were committing suicide. Others were struggling with financial issues, going broke. People were getting divorced. People were committing suicide, not committing suicide. I was taught last night to not say committing suicide. People were struggling. In essence, our front was not matching our back. What we were speaking out in the world was not reflective of how we were living. There was so much conflict within the organizing circles, the change circles, at every level. And people were gossiping about each other, treating people way less than human beings deserve to be treated. And so we have to look at that as well. And as fate would have it, because of my drinking, in 2017, I landed in the hospital with my second bout of pancreatitis. And I don't know if anybody in this room has ever had pancreatitis, but it is literally the worst pain I've ever experienced in my life. And they had to have me on every pain medication you can imagine. The doctors told me that I was near death. If I didn't get to the hospital, I was supposed to get on a flight to Philadelphia this morning. And it's ironic because the first time I had pancreatitis, I was coming back on a flight from Ann Arbor. And this morning I was supposed to get on a flight to Philadelphia, but it had snowed in Seattle, so all the flights were canceled. And then eventually, my partner, I couldn't even make it out of the house, but my partner drove me to the hospital. And like I said, the doctors were like, thank God you got here in time. So I was in the hospital for a week, and a good friend of mine really lovingly challenged me about my drinking. And as he challenged me about my drinking, At the same time, I was also going through some spiritual seeking. I was asking the universe for spiritual growth. And as the universe sometimes gives us what we ask for, it doesn't always come in the most gentle of ways. And mine came through pancreatitis, right? And so, as I was looking at all of this, what was happening with myself, all of our colleagues, how unhappy we were, that was really reflective of the work we were doing in the world. We were problem focused, externally and internally, but we weren't solution focused. We were not centered in reflecting from ourselves the work we wanted to create externally. You know, there's an ancient saying, as above, so below, so above, as within, so without. And what we came to understand is that our collective world, our outer world, was reflective of our collective inner world. And so we started to approach our work in a very different way. Instead of being what we were against, we were calling ourselves anti-racist, we had to decide what we were for. And we came to understand that racism, sexism, heterosexism, all the isms were created to divide people, human beings, the human family, for the purposes of power and control. And so the antidote to that has got to be bringing people back together. And hence, we came up with the term human solidarity. And the spirit of human solidarity is for us to come back together as a human family, to no longer be divided by created false constructs like race, like gender, and to see what we have more in common than what divides us. But we also know, as we said, as within, so without, that we cannot get to a state of collective human solidarity until we begin to do the work of self-solidarity and understanding the damage that living in this society, this world, has done to all of us. All of us. You know, I think about the president of our board is Hank Azaria, the famous actor, and his best friend, Matthew Perry, you know, very wealthy, you know, superstar friends, found dead from an overdose in a hot tub. And you know, we do, as I said earlier, we do a lot of work in Hollywood, and we're working with a lot of famous actors, producers, many of you all would know. And the level of internal suffering, I mean, these people have celebrity, all the money in the world, everything we think we're supposed to have, but their lives are collapsing, the vast majority of them. And so, there are levels of power. We used to just focus on structural systemic power, but we believe that it's time for us, if we're ever going to change the unhealthy dynamics of structural power, we have to start to get in touch with our inner power. And so self-solidarity, if I'm in self-solidarity, this brother's in self-solidarity, Daniel's in self-solidarity, then we can come together and create something new, something different. So one of our sayings is, we retired from fighting against anything. We don't believe powerful people fight against anything. Powerful people create what they want to experience. And so we're going to go to the next slide. I want to ask you all a question. I'm going to ask some of you to just think for a second. When we think about the collective suffering we see in the world, what are some examples that come to mind that shows you, that tells you that the human family is in a state of suffering right now? This is open for anyone. We won't have time to walk around with a bunch of mics, so you're going to have to yell it out. And if folks don't yell it out, I'm a very trained facilitator, so I will call on people. Even though my friends ask me not to call them over here. So what are some of the evidence that we see that the human family is suffering right now?
Domestic violence.
So domestic violence, right? So we see domestic violence in every, and Daniel's going to describe a lot of this. We see domestic violence at every single level, right? Somebody else? Gaza. So how do you see the suffering in Gaza? Say it loud. Hate between two groups that doesn't make sense, and a lot of death and suffering, right? Children being dying. What else? What other suffering do we see in the world?
People working 40 hours a week and not being able to afford to live in a house.
So people working for, sometimes you said 40 hours, sometimes 50, 60 hours, and can't afford to live in a house, buy a home. What else?
Food insecurity.
So food insecurity. How do you see food insecurity?
We see it in our schools, with our children, the folks that we work with every day, our clients.
Okay. Okay. So you see it with children, right? You we were last night over dinner, we were talking about the fact that we were able to build a military base in the mountain here in Colorado Springs, but we can't afford to feed every child in our country. That's absurd, right? What else? The political divide, right? We have people, it's interesting when you say the political divide, because if you turn on CNN or Fox or MSNBC, our social media feed, we're fed with all sorts of political divide. But my experience, we do this work in a lot of red states with a lot of very conservative people, but when we sit down and really have a conversation in depth, we see so much more in common than we have that divides us. And a lot of times, people are like, I just didn't even know. I didn't even understand what was being said, when we're talking about race, for example, things like that, right? So we have a manufactured political divide. What else?
Veteran suicide.
So veteran suicide. And so those numbers are rising, correct?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Couple more. Mass incarceration, right? And it's interesting, we look at mass incarceration as a response to the civil rights movement. Prior to the civil rights movement, we had roughly 200-some thousand people that were incarcerated in the United States. Post now, we have well over 2 million, and I'm sure the numbers are much higher when you include the whole system, county jails, et cetera, et cetera. It's mass incarceration. And the vast majority of folks incarcerated are poor people. Couple more. So substance abuse and mental health. We see a lot of people, I don't know what it's like in Denver, but there's a opioid fentanyl crisis that's off the charts in Seattle. Downtown Seattle, prior to COVID, used to be vibrant. Now when you go downtown, you just see mass addiction. And when we think about the type of addiction that we're seeing in society, it's not just what we see on the streets, because it's happening inside of our homes as well. People are seeking to numb themselves out, not feel. Last week we were working with a police department, and a sergeant, somehow we were talking about fentanyl use, and the sergeant stood up, grizzled veteran, talked about there's a lot of officers that are using fentanyl to numb themselves out for the trauma they experience on a day-to-day basis. Couple more. Yes?
Homophobia and transphobia.
Homophobia and transphobia, right? Definitely. Couple more. I'm gonna come. So say it one more time. Unresolved trauma from abuse and neglect as a child, absolutely. We have a lot of adults walking around in adult bodies that are essentially wounded children. Say it one more time. The kids that age out of the foster care system, they're not taken care of, right? We have a lot of unhealed trauma and abuse in our society, and a lot of wounded children. The ones that we see in the foster care system are the ones in other systems that get access to services are ones we know. But we have a lot of people that can wear the adult mask and fake it, but are walking around as wounded children. Heard somebody over here?
Fear of deportation.
Absolutely, fear of deportation. Maybe one or two more. So when you say that, what do you mean by that? Just press it. Absolutely, we don't know how to communicate with each other. We were talking about this over dinner. We don't know how to really connect with each other. I coach an AAU basketball team, and we travel, and it's so crazy. These are kids from Seattle. We're out in Pennsylvania. They're sitting in the cheesesteak restaurant. None of them had this, and I looked up, and every single one of them are on their phone, not talking to each other. Right? One more.
Increase in truancy rates and divorce rates.
So increase in divorce rates, and what was the first one?
Truancy rates.
Truancy rates. And I heard one more over here.
Suicide.
Rising numbers of suicide. We do a lot of work on with tribes in Oregon, and it feels like almost every time we go, and we're in Oregon at least once, twice a month. It feels like every time we go, someone, and not just young people, but an elder, someone middle-aged, somebody has engaged in suicide. I'm trying to remember the right way to say it.
Completed.
What's that? Completed? Okay. So now, I know we could probably spend the whole morning really laying out a list of suffering. But I want to ask you just two questions. When we think about this suffering, and I heard you talk about, a lot of you talk about our children, it It makes me think of a time being at an Indian child welfare conference, and an elder who had been working in Indian child welfare for 20-some years, 25 years, she said, we did a list very similar, very focused on the suffering we see within the context of Indian child welfare. And she said, this list that we're making today in 2024 was the same list that we made 25 years ago. We haven't really shifted anything. And so the question I have for you all, when we think about this suffering that we see across our society, that has been going on for generations, what has been our typical collective response to this suffering? How have we attempted to address this? We're very reactive. How are we reactive? What's that? So we create more jails? Okay, what other ways have we attempted to address this collective suffering?
We want government to fix it.
So we petition government to fix it, right? What else?
Bury our heads in the sand.
We often bury our heads in the sand. When we get numbed out, we act like it's not happening. Do we march and protest? We just saw that this past weekend, right? Right? Typically, there's a lot of reactionary protests. Something happens, and people gather in the streets. They make demands. Then everything dies down, and the same stuff keeps happening. We might create some new initiatives and new programs to address some of this stuff. We might put some money towards it. These are the things that we were attempting to do. But the question is, if we have some critical thinking about what has been our collective response to this ongoing cycle of suffering in our society, the question is, have we been effective so far? Yes or no?
No.
I want to hear y'all, make sure we're on the same page. Have we been effective? Yes or no?
No.
But we keep doing the same thing over and over. And this is a rhetorical question, but what does that say about us? And the state of our minds and our thinking? Rhetorical question at this point. I also want to ask, when we look at this ongoing cycle of suffering, and this is not rhetorical, the fact that we allow this to continue generation after generation, and I know there's a lot of parents in this room, we're passing down this cycle of suffering to our children, our babies. What does that say about the collective state of our emotional, mental, and spiritual health? What does that say about us as leaders, that we're passing down this? It's an actual question. What's that? So you feel like we failed? What's that? So we're contributing to the problem of the suffering. And this is not a question for indictment. This is a question for curious, vulnerable reflection. What else? What does this say about us?
We're failing to see the humanity in our fellow man.
We're failing to see the humanity. It's so true, we have absolutely lost sight in seeing ourselves in each other. Right? And if we were able to see ourselves in each other, there's no way that we could walk by someone's grandmother or grandfather sleeping on the street. There's no way we would allow that. I remember when my oldest son was 5, there's a grocery store in Seattle that we used to always go to, and there would be a homeless man outside asking for money for food. And Kalen, in his infinite wisdom, would say to me, "Dad, how is he asking for money for food when there's all that food inside? How is he hungry?" And at that time, because I wasn't clear of my consciousness, I said, "Well, son, you don't understand, it's this and that." And he wouldn't go for that. He was still connected to his inherent wisdom and brilliance. It just didn't make sense. And we know that we throw away, Daniel said last night, we throw away more food probably than we sell. And so, if we are going to move forward as a society, if we were ever going to get to creating what Dr. King would talk about, the beloved community, or what we would say is human solidarity, we have to look at how have we, as leaders, been numbed out and been doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. We've been missing something in the process. And we were stuck on that loop as well. But we're offering an opportunity for us just to consider a pathway to breakthrough. And so, I want to ask, how many people How many people work with disempowered people in your life, in your work? Raise your hand high if you do. How many people work with disempowered people? Okay, what I want to do, we're going to just take literally 3 minutes at the tables you're sitting. We want you all to talk, 4 minutes. I want you to talk with each other. What are some of the signs that tells you a person is disempowered? You know, what is their self-talk like? What type of decisions do they make? What are their relationships like? What is their belief in their self? What kind of habits do they have that shows you that person is disempowered? We're going to come back and talk about that, okay? So let's say 5-minute table talk, and we'll come back, okay? So let's begin. So, we want to hear from you, what were some of the signs that you identified that tells you a person is disempowered? Folks can throw them out.
Disengagement from a system that was not designed for individuals who need the actual help.
And so how do you see that disengagement?
They don't trust the system. We roll out the red carpet and, hey, we got all these services for you, but not the ones that will pull you up out of your current situation. Because until you have a home, I'm not trying to come see you once, twice a week for therapy.
Right.
This is coming from a therapist who I love what I do, and I drank the Kool-Aid on my profession. But come on, folks, if I don't have a house, I'm not trying to come see you. People are stealing my stuff. So that keeps that wheel going. And I've been to Seattle. I've seen when the sun goes down, people come out, and it's terrible. But it's the same thing we've been doing, like that owner from the tribe said. We've been doing this for 20 years. Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed.
So we see signs of distrust.
Absolutely.
Okay, good. What else? So we see a lot of anger and rage, right? Directed externally and internally. What else? So we see them showing, how do they show hopelessness?
They're not advocating for themselves, they don't feel empowered to advocate for themselves or their family or whatever situation they're in.
So they're silencing themselves, not speaking up for themselves. Okay, what else?
Lack of self-worth.
So they show signs of they're not worth fighting for. And what did you say?
Lack of self-worth.
So how do they show lack of self-worth though?
They limit themselves. They have a lot of, well, I don't have any choice, and they're making choices that limit themselves.
So they limit themselves, and they shrink the possibility of choice that they have. Okay, some more.
Try and exercise any control you can.
So they can be controlling in an attempt to assert some level of agency over their lives. Okay, good. What else? So they rotate in and out of the criminal justice system.
You're doing it right now.
So they have a sense of victimization. Okay, what'd you say?
You're doing it right now. Us and them.
Okay. What else? What do their relationships often look like?
Dysfunctional.
So a lot of dysfunction. What type of dysfunction?
Allowing themselves to be treated poorly.
So allowing themselves to be treated poorly, so a lot of abuse, mental, emotional abuse, and kind of cycles of that, right? What about their relationship with if they have children? How does that look? So it looks unhealthy,
They're
disconnected,
disconnected.
disassociated, not present. Okay. What about their self-talk? What is some disempowered self-talk you might imagine? So really defeatist. I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. They won't let me. I can't. That type of stuff. Okay. And maybe a lot of replaying, a lot of negative experiences in life, right? Okay. So pretty good list. Pretty good list. And again, we could add more. Bless you. So the first question is, we made this list thinking about the disempowered people that we work with. But I want to ask a vulnerable question to this room. How many people, based on what you've heard, what you talked about at your table, what you see up here, if you can see the flip chart, how many people can see yourself on this list? Raise your hand. Put them up high if you can see yourself on this list. I appreciate those who raise your hand being honest and vulnerable. And so, the question then must be for us, what does it mean if we are in a state of disempowerment, working with people that are in a state of disempowerment? What are we creating with that dynamic? I'm going to tell you, we asked the police department we were working with, we asked a variation of this question when we focused on trauma. The trauma that they were experiencing. Of course, they talked about, seeing all the violence they see, the drinking, the numb out, not caring anymore, getting divorced. They talked about, the level of death, children dying, car accidents, seeing the ugly side of humanity day in and day out. So they developed this disempowerment or trauma box that they have as officers. Then we framed this other scenario. We were in Indianapolis working with a group of social workers, and one of the social workers brought a 13-year-old child with him who had just saw his best friend get their brains blown out. And if you know anything about Indianapolis, it's like Chicago. The gun violence is off the charts. And so we asked those officers to talk about what type of trauma must this child have had from that experience. So a lot of fear, hypervigilance, not trusting life, wondering why the adults didn't protect him. And not only did this child experience that trauma, but he's living in a community where gunplay is very normal and other levels of human disconnection. And so then the question would be, and it's the same question we're asking you, is would those two unhealed trauma boxes or those two unhealed disempowerment boxes come together? So say the officers get a call to the mall and these, some young kids are acting out in the food court, and that kid is there, and that officer with that unhealed trauma, when those two boxes come together, it's bound to create an explosion of unhealthiness. And yet still, for those of you who raised your hand and said you're on this list, typically we're sitting in rooms of 50 people, and 49 people always raise their hand and say they see themselves on this list. But then it begs so many questions for us. If we understand that we are getting jobs, policing communities, teaching communities, providing mental health support, therapeutic support, addiction services, whatever it is that we do, but we've never mandated that the folks providing the service heal from their disempowerment, their trauma. In essence, we're saying it's okay to continue a cycle, a loop of disempowerment, and we're supporting it. But then we say we have all this suffering in the world, we want to be change agents, but we've never mandated in our agencies, and we're not saying mandate from a punitive place, but we've never mandated that there should be healing. And so, thinking about, my mother was a CPS social worker in Camden, New Jersey. And this was so, I didn't understand this so much later, my mother had unhealed trauma. So she's taken away, so if you know anything about Camden, New Jersey, it's a rough city. So she's taking away other children while I was at home being physically, mentally, and emotionally abused by my stepfather. There's a dissonance there. And then eventually my mother would become, still to this day, an active addiction, right? And so we allow cycles of disempowerment to go on in our jobs and our agencies, and we're so focused on healing other people's disempowerment, but we never look at physician heal thyself. And we're essentially licensing, legitimizing, endorsing a cycle of trauma. And it's no wonder we have this ongoing suffering we have. And so we have essentially created a society where we have a normalization of disempowerment. And we have set the floor so low for how we show up in our world that we can go, through 4 years, get a degree, wear the mask, get the job, play the game. But many of us are living and dying with unhealed disempowerment. And we're passing this down. And of course, this is reflective of the institutional outcomes we create. And so, when we think about the normalization of disempowerment, we can see it in our movies, we can see it in our music. We celebrate superstars who are living out disempowerment. We can't wait to read stories about famous people and their disempowerment. it's become so normalized in our society, and this got into us through the process of socialization. And so I want to share a quick study that really looks at socialization. And this was a study done by Dr. George Land, who's a neuroscientist. And so this was back in the 60s. And at that time, NASA was already talking about going to Mars. And what they understood is that if we're going to send human beings into space, into a very incongenial environment to Mars, where there's going to be no emergency support, we're going to have to send our best and brightest. We're going to have to be able to problem solve on the ground with anything they're going to face. And so they were having trouble at NASA getting the best and brightest together, the most creative thinkers together. And so they brought Dr. Land in, and he commissioned a study. And through this study, they were able to identify those at NASA who showed the highest level of creative genius. And because this study was so effective, they decided to do a longitudinal study with students. And so they had students from Head Start, 1,600 students, and they tracked them over the course of 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and 20 years. And so I want to ask you a question. When they tested the students at 5 years old, what do you think the percentage of them was that showed creative genius? Throw it out, any guess? Okay, close, 98%. 98% of 5-year-olds tested showed levels of creative genius. So I'm sure all of us can think about when our children were 5 years old and what they were able to do and how they talked, what they thought about, how they solved things. And this is us as well. When we think about this, it's not just our kids. At 5 years old, 98% of us, so essentially all of us, were in the level of creative genius. Then when they tested the students at 10 years old, what do you think the number was? 30%. Got down to 30%. And then they tested the students at 15 years old. What do you think the number was? 12%. And then by the time they were 20, and think about it, many of these kids were in college. Some of them were working jobs. What do you think the number was then at 20? 2%. 2%. And so, at 5 years old, our kids enter into the education system, showing amazing levels of creative genius. And as they matriculate through the education system, not just through the education system, they're getting socialized from everywhere in our society, from the media, from their parents, from their community, from their religion. They're getting socialized in all sorts of ways. And as our kids grow, by the time we're 20 years old, only 2% of us are showing creative genius. Now, to solve the problems that we talked about, the suffering, the ongoing cycle of suffering, would you all agree that we need to be in our creative genius to solve that? Yes or no? Yeah. But the question is, we have not looked at the weight of our socialization and how our socialization has taken us out of our creative genius. And so, one of the things that we've done at the Human Solidarity Project with all of us, and this is an ongoing conversation, you look at in that box to symbolize how we get boxed into our socialization. That's me when I think I was like 6 or 7, right? Excuse me. I'm not a real good PowerPoint guy, so forgive me. But that's me in that box. At 7, and getting socialized and bombarded from my mom's addiction, what's happening with my stepfather, going to school, what I'm learning at church, what I'm learning from my peers. I'm getting all sorts of messages, both overtly and covertly, and they become my box. And I was that kid that was always asking, like many of us in this room, always asking that why question. Why? And what did I get told a lot? Because, or stop asking me why, right? We do that to our kids. So when we think about the weight of our socialization and all this disempowerment, I want to talk about some pillars of socialization. And these are more socio-political pillars, but we have a pillar around race that is a bias in favor of white in our society and a bias against people of color, all people of color. We have a bias in favor of men and a bias against women in our society. We have a bias in favor of the wealthy and a bias against the poor in our society. We have a bias in favor of heterosexism and a bias in favor of the LGBTQ. And there's many other pillars that we get. And we get socialized into these pillars, again, from all those institutions and forces that condition and socialize us. And so when you think about the bias in favor of men and against women, is there any examples, really quickly, examples that would show that that bias is in fact true? So pay discrepancies. What else? What's that? Health research. Health research is geared towards men and not for women. What else? Discrepancies in health outcomes. What, somebody in the back? So people in leadership who seem to be a leader, who should be a leader, and who has access to positions of leadership. Anything else?
Wage gap.
So the wage gap. You don't want, what's that? Keynote speakers at conferences. Yep. Yep.
I would say locker room talk.
Locker room talk. Language.
Boards of directors.
Boards of directors. What about even in parenting? I know, I have always prided myself on being the best dad ever until my partner came to me with a list of 60 things that she has to think about and do that I never even considered, right? And I'm spending my life going around talking about equity, and she's like, "Hold up, D, we need some equity right here at home," right? Now, I say this as I lay out all these pillars. This has nothing to do with anybody being good or bad. This is about how we've been conditioned and socialized. And I want to say it's not just men that get the bias in favor of men and against women. Women have also been conditioned into this as well. It is not just people of color that get the bias in favor of white and against people of color. We've all internalized all those messages. And it's reflective of how we relate to each other. It determines how we engage with each other. And it determines the outcomes we see across every institution and system. And so the question is, for us, where does this reside in us? And this next piece we're going to share is probably the most important concept you will hear from the Human Solidarity Project. And for us to best illustrate this piece is to share a little story. And what you see up here is the Duwamish River, which is a river that runs in the south part of Seattle, and it's right adjacent to Bowman Field. And the Duwamish River was named after the Duwamish people that were the indigenous people of that part of what is now Washington State. And the Duwamish people use this river for traveling to go visit other tribes. They use it for fishing, for salmon, for seafood to eat. It had a very spiritual resonance for the Duwamish people. Now, as Seattle was being built up, as Boeing was being built, many other factories were built along the river. And these factories started releasing a lot of pollutants and toxins into the river. And adjacent to the river, there's also a community called South Park, which is a primarily poor working class Latino community. So a lot of people were fishing in this river for salmon and other fish to eat, to put food on the table. And so Seattle, being again a very progressive, environmentally conscious city, they started to study the quality of the fish. And what they found is that this fish should not be eaten by human beings for the next 1,000 years. And so what they decided to do, again, being a very environmentally conscious community, they got together with community groups in South Park, the city of Seattle, the University of Washington. They started to study the water and the seafood, the fish, at a deeper level. Then eventually Washington State got involved, provided more funding. Then eventually the feds got involved and they declared it a Superfund site. So they spent a lot of money and labor trying to fix this body of water. They would remove the fish, take a generation of fish out, put them into clean water, and then eventually put the fresh new fish back in. They would remove large sediments of water, dredge the topsoil. They did all kinds of work. Then after this was all said and done, and they went back and they studied the fish again, they found, lo and behold, after all this millions of dollars and all this labor, this fish still is not edible for human consumption. They missed something very, very critical in their cleanup process. And it's something that we often miss in our cleanup process in terms of the changes we seek to make in our own lives, as well as the changes we seek to make in our professional lives. And they miss the fact that the water, the toxins, the pollutants, seep below the soil level into the groundwater. And 98% of all water, fresh body water in the mainland US is fed by ground springs. So the toxins have seeped below the conscious level, if you will, into the groundwater. And so, when we think about those pillars of oppression we talked about, I speculate there could be someone in the room saying, I don't have a bias against people of color. I don't have a bias in favor of white. I don't have a bias in favor of men and against women. And what we would say that you probably don't at a conscious level. That might be very true. But we have to take this conversation to a much deeper level. And I'm sure many of you have seen this illustration of the iceberg. And what you see is a small part of the iceberg above the water level, which is representative of our conscious mind. And we are in our conscious mind roughly 2 to 5% of our lives, of our days. We make conscious level decisions, choices, 2 to 5%. When we see the large mass of the iceberg below the water level, that is analogous of our subconscious mind, which is 95 to 98% of what we do on a day-to-day basis. Our subconscious mind is controlling our digestive system, our breathing. It's also controlling how we feel about ourselves, who we trust, who we don't trust, what type of relationships we get in, what type of love we feel like we deserve, how do we feel like we really deserve to be treated, what kind of jobs do we have, what kind of financial decisions do we make. We're making all those decisions by and large from our subconscious mind, and it determines every aspect of our life. And when we think about those pillars that we laid out, each of those pillars resides in our subconscious mind as well. None of us asked for them. It's a product of being socialized in this society and how this society has been constructed. And so what you see up on the board is delta. From 0 to 2, our brains are in something called a delta. Many of you, I'm sure, know this as therapists, but our brains are in something predominantly called a delta frequency, which is a dreamlike state. And then from 2 to 7, we're in something called a theta frequency, which is essentially a state of hypnosis, predominantly a theta frequency. And between the ages of 2 to 7, we're downloading all sorts of messages from the world. What's good, what's bad, who's beautiful, who's ugly, what's right, what's wrong. Who do our parents smile at a grocery store? Who do they not smile at? Why does our community look this way? What kind of food do we have? What do our grocery stores look like? How do our parents, communicate with each other? How do they deal with conflict? We're downloading all sorts of messages, overtly and covertly. By 7, they will get locked into our neural pathways and become what is our subconscious program, our subconscious mind, or what we would call our groundwater. And the problem is not that we have a subconscious mind. We get all kinds of messages. We get messages of how to be kind to other people, how to be loving to other people. But for the sake of our conversation, today it's important that we understand we also get toxic messages. And we have to explore our toxic groundwater. And so, Carl Jung would say that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate. And so, when we think about the subconscious toxic groundwater, the toxic part of our subconscious mind, it manifests through a series of tendencies, habits, and patterns. I'm sure many of you have driven a place, maybe, to work, somewhere you go every single day. So you leave your home, and you end up at work, and you don't even remember how you got there, right? Anybody had that experience before? Right? And so think about when you first started driving. You had to be very much in your conscious mind. You had to be very conscious of braking, stopping, red lights, stop signs. You know, I'm sure there was someone next to you, an adult, you know, that was stressing you out. So you had to be very much in your conscious mind, right? Right? But now, we can drive. We don't even think about it. We get in the car because driving is now in our subconscious programming. So we could be listening to music, thinking about, you know, the conversation we have with our wife or our husband, right? Thinking about what we got to do at work, you know, texting, emailing, all the stuff that we do. Some of it we should be doing. And we're, lo and behold, we're at work because our subconscious mind is taking us there. And that's what our subconscious mind does in our lives. It takes us to places, often because of the toxic programming, it takes us to places over and over again that we don't want to be at. Our subconscious mind is on autopilot, and our subconscious mind is literal. Subconscious mind has no filter of good or bad, right or wrong. Whatever is impressed upon it, that's what it will take in, and that's what it will manifest and create in our lives. And so when we think about those pillars that we just talked about, the pillar of the bias against women and in favor of men, and the outcomes people talked about around wage disparities, keynote speakers, board of directors, CEOs. We are on autopilot with that as a society. Now, some of us have come to conscious awareness around patriarchy and things like that. Like, my grandmother was very much a black feminist. She would call herself a feminist. She would have said she was a womanist in the realm of Alice Walker. And so I grew up hearing her and my mother and my aunts talking about how they were treated at work, how they had to have lawsuits. My grandmother became the director of professional services for the state of New Jersey, and how she had to sue because of the sexism she was facing, right? So I grew up in this. But I remember coming in from a trip one day, traveling in, and my mother, my grandmother, my aunt were sitting in the house, and my cousin who was pregnant, and they were sitting in all the chairs. And my aunt just said unconsciously to my cousin, Farrah, get up. So Dustin, just sit down. Like, a man's in the room, you gotta get up. She said this to her pregnant daughter. Now, this was all unconscious. Now, Farrah, to her credit, said, no, I'm not getting up, right? But this was just on autopilot. I didn't even catch it until I reflected on it afterwards, right? Because this is just in our groundwater. And the only way for us to heal this, and ultimately to heal the outcomes that we face, and the disempowerment that we face, is to recognize that this is here, and that we are not operating from our conscious mind. So when I talked about Seattle, all the folks that we trained, we have every policy you ever need for there not to be inequities. We have the toolkit. We have conscious-minded, well-intentioned, good people. But we're still producing outcomes that are no different than Alabama or Mississippi. Because we've been doing this from a conscious level, but we have not looked at how this stuff has seeped into our unconsciousness, our subconscious program. So I want to ask you all just to think for a second. I want you to just give you 30 seconds. I want you to think about one negative message you remember hearing at a young age about your race or the race of someone else. One negative message you remember hearing at a young age about your race or the race of someone else. Just give you 30 seconds. Just want to hear from a few people. Yeah. And I'm going to ask some people to be courageous, because I know this is hard to share in front of a lot of people. And I'll start us off to give you an example. So growing up in New Jersey, like, I'm a huge history guy. Like, I could sit up here for 2 hours and just give you the whole history of the construction of race and racism in minutia. I love history. So growing up, you know, I would go to all the Revolutionary War sites. I mean, I was just fascinated. I still am to this day. But as I look back, I look about the history I was taught. The only thing I learned about black people was in the context of slavery, Harriet Tubman, maybe Martin Luther King. The only thing I learned about Native people, indigenous people, hunters and gatherers. Didn't learn anything about Latino people. The only thing I learned about Asian people was Japanese people in World War II in a negative light. The only people that I learned about in history that created civilization, that did the most wonderful things throughout history were white people. So that was in my groundwater. Now it wouldn't be later until I started to do conscious work that change. So I want to ask you all that I learned white people created everything. And so I want to ask you all just to share it. Don't qualify it. Just share one negative message. And what we're looking for is the implicit message behind that. Who would like to start us off?
Derogatory slang for Brazilian men.
So derogatory slang for Brazilian. So implicitly, that Brazilian men are less than. Would that be a fair paraphrase?
No, but Brazilian nuts is derogatory slang that was told to us to call those Brazilian nuts ignorant.
Okay, so what's the implicit message behind that?
Well, derogatory is a word for African Americans, right?
Oh.
That word just.
Okay, I got you. So-
They were called N-codes.
Okay, so then African Americans are less than. Okay, what else?
Black women over-sexualized.
What's that?
Black women over-sexualized.
So black women over-sexualized. Okay, good. What else?
Let's talk about black men committing more crime.
So black men are more criminal. What else? Say that again. So no such thing as white male privilege.
Greasy Mexicans.
So greasy Mexicans. What else?
Our drug problem was created by foreigners,
So our drug problem is created by what specific foreigners?
either brown or yellow.
So our drug problem is created by brown or yellow people. What else?
My mom used to tell me not to date certain races, like black people or Mexican people.
So if your mom told you not to date black or Mexican people, I'm sure other people in the room have heard that as well. What was the implicit message there?
That they're probably not worthy of love or affection of any kind.
So not worthy of, the men of color not worthy of love and affection, also not worthy to date you, right? Not good enough for you. Couple more. Yes. What's that? So then we'll say Mexican Latino men are dangerous. Okay. There's a hand here.
I was raised in a rural part of, and we had nurses.
Can you say it a little louder?
A rural part of Colorado in a small school, and we were really excited because we were going to have a black student teacher come in and teach us. And I was just thinking about this. She told my mother in a student teacher conference that white children can't learn from black.
So white children can't learn from a black teacher. Couple more.
Slavery ended over a century ago. It doesn't have an impact on modern day.
So slavery ended a century ago, doesn't have impact. So what I would paraphrase is get over it.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else?
All white people are racist.
What's that?
All white people are racist.
All white people are racist. Now, if we were in a room of 50 people, we would push everybody to share something. Because the truth is, we've all heard something negative, right? And so when we think about this list, the folks that shared, these are things, and these are some ugly things. White people created everything. African Americans are less than. Black women over-sexualized. If we paraphrase that out, we can put some uglier words around that. Black men are criminals. There's no such thing as white male privilege. Greasy Mexicans. Our drug problems are because of brown and yellow immigrants. Men of color not worthy of love. Not good enough to date. Mexican Latino men are dangerous. White children can't learn from black, and all white people are racist. So when we think about that, those are things we were able to call up from our conscious mind. Think about how many other ugly, toxic messages that are swimming in your subconscious mind. So when we think about the outcomes we have, all the policies, civil rights laws, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it is no wonder that we still have the racial disproportionality that we have across every system, because we have been attempting to make the level of change from a conscious-minded place, but we've yet to do the work from a subconscious-minded place. And we are on autopilot in terms of what we are creating and producing in our systems. And so our contention is that if we do not heal our collective and individual toxic groundwater, our kids will be sitting in a conference like this, probably with more men speaking, talking about the same outcomes that we've been talking about. We believe the pathway to human solidarity is by us working to cleanse our toxic groundwater. Our toxic groundwater is keeping us in a state of human disconnection, in a state of perpetual disempowerment that we've normalized and accepted. And we don't believe that we are going to be able to move forward and get to the place of creating the solutions, because all these problems we're faced, we have the capacity to create the solutions for. But this toxic groundwater will keep us in a loop and keep us producing what we're currently producing. And for us, this cause is not just white people, not just men. All of us have downloaded a whole host of ugliness. You know, in my prior incarnation, we would put the problem just on white people. But what we're saying now is that all of us are part of this problem. Every one of us has downloaded this ugliness. So we could go to a city and institution that's predominantly people of color, and we believe we would produce the same exact outcomes because we have the same groundwater. So that belief, when we talk about black men as criminals, black men as dangerous, not good enough, we've downloaded those messages about ourselves as well. Women have downloaded their message about their worth and place. Now, many of us, again, have done the conscious level work, but we have to be mindful of how our subconscious programs will seep in and create human disconnection in our relationships. And so, the last thing we want to share, you know, we put up this slide with these puppets, kind of the puppet master. This is how the society is causing us to dance because of the groundwater. Think about it, we just came out of a presidential election where both campaigns spent billions of dollars for neuroscientists and psychologists to design ads that were designed to go right past our critical thinking mind, past our conscious mind, right to our groundwater, and play on all those ugly messages that they know have seeped in. And we are just being led by this until we decide to get free from the toxic groundwater. And so, what we want to do is we only have 15 minutes left. We want to put up, I'm going to skip ahead, and we want to put up, QR code. And this QR code, this is a gift, this is a $20 gift from us to you. And there's a groundwater journal in here. It's a tool you can use if you so choose to use to begin to explore both your individual as well as your collective groundwater, to start to engage in a healing process. But what we want to do right now, myself and Daniel, we want to see if there's any questions, thoughts from the presentation before we close out. It's really important for us to engage in the conversation. And before we start the Q&A, thank you all first for participating. So this talk works everywhere we go. And the groundwater, you know, of course, different history, different social dynamics, right? But the groundwater, the pillars, all those pillars are in place everywhere we go. So the conversation works really well. And the groundwater is in play everywhere. And you see that by the outcomes we're producing in that chair. Were you thinking about a specific place internationally?
Just wondering about major differences.
Yeah. I mean, the major difference is just the history, really. You know, so I was at the Nobel Summit in Warsaw, Poland, and we did a presentation around the groundwater, and this resonated with them tremendously, because they could see how the groundwater from their history, whether it's from the Nazi occupation and the lingering multi-generational pain, their relationship to how they see when students of color, you know, come to attend universities there, immigrants,